Alright, this is going to be the first video in a while now. I am back in the US and I have taken a break for a bit, but I'm going to jump right back in and do a quick overview of the upcoming state elections this October in Bavaria and Hessen. So for those of you who don't know, there is two state elections in Germany happening. The German states have elections every 5 years, and so every year there's different states that will have their elections, and these are kind of used as bellwethers for the national politics, and of course they do matter to the individual states themselves. And the two states in particular that we're going to talk about have some interesting dynamics, interesting political history behind them, and are important states. So these elections will matter for the national parties and the national environment. And I just want to take a brief overview of what happened last time in 2018 and also what's going on in the polls. So the first state I want to talk about is Hessen. Now Hessen is a state in the middle of Germany. It is the state where Frankfurt is, and we have an incumbent governor from the CDU with the Green Party also as a part of that government. So it's a black-green government in the state. Previously, the CDU and the SPD had been the dominant parties, but in 2018, there was a drop in support from the traditional parties, and the AFD and the Greens kind of surged to prominence in that state, and they're still behind, as you can see in the polls, as third and fourth, but nonetheless it is a very close race. Now initially it looked like the AFD was going to be a bit stronger. They were polling at around 18%. They've since dropped to 16%. The Greens and the SPD are both around 19%. The CDU has actually increased, was at around 25 and is at 29. And the thing is the polls, as well as in Bavaria, have been very kind of all over the place. So it's kind of hard to predict what is going to happen, the exact number of votes each party is going to get. Nonetheless, it is not a great result for the traditional parties, the CDU and the SPD. Historically they've been polling a lot higher than this, so they want to be at a higher position. Nonetheless, this is a good result for the CDU. Them being in first place means that they will retain the governorship unless they get taken out by the SPD. Now, the SPD candidate, Nancy Faeser, is running for governor. Now, in Germany, you don't technically run for governor because it's not the people that elect it. It is the state legislature, the parliament, the Landtag, that elects who is governor after you form a government. However, it is customary that the major parties will have someone that declares that they are running for this position officially. And the SPD federal interior minister, who is in, of course, the federal cabinet in the Bundestag, is running for the governor position for the SPD in the state. And she is a politician that was formerly in the state legislature here, someone that has name recognition, someone that's not particularly too popular, but someone that has kind of the experience and probably is a good fit for the party. And that's why she is their lead candidate. However, it doesn't look like there is much effect to that. A while when she announced in the past, she brought the SPD up to around over 20%, and clearly above the Greens, and looked like it was in striking distance of the CDU. However, now we have the CDU with a 10-point lead over the SPD. Now, if Faeser wants to become governor, she has to do one of two things. She either has to overtake the CDU and form a coalition with them in which she will be governor, or she has to just hold second place above the Greens, and the SPD and Greens and FDP, or the SPD, Greens, and Left Party have to form a majority. That means they have to get a majority in the election, which as of now is not too certain. The Greens and the SPD together don't have it, and the current constellation, the traffic light coalition, which would be red, green, yellow, the same one we have at the federal level, is also polling below a majority. So, she gets a few more points. If the Greens and SPD get a bit higher, then she could become governor as long as she holds second place. But then if the FDP falls below 5%, that's probably not going to happen. Nonetheless, I do think what's most likely is that the CDU will hold first place, and they will probably form another coalition government with the Greens, unless anything changes. The AFD is at 16.6% in the polling aggregate. This is definitely an increase from their 2018 result, where they got 13%, and this was already on a very good result for the party. This was kind of the tail end of the high wave of the AFD after the response to the migration crisis, and this was also the beginning of the Greens kind of surge that happened with all the youth movements and Fridays for Future and everything. So this was definitely an important point in German politics when this election happened 5 years ago. The AFD is definitely increasing their support in this state, which is of course, in line with what's happening at the national level. 16% is a good result for them, but of course, I think they, in some polls, were polling at 20%, but we'll see what happens. The FDP is right now at 5.9, which will be enough to get them in the state legislature, but that's not too much. If they fall below 5, of course, if you fall below 5% in a German state or the federal elections, you won't get any seats. So that is the important number. The Left Party, which this is one of the very few West German states that the Left Party had managed to have representation in. They were polling at 2.7%. It looks like it's going to be very, pretty much impossible for them to get in. It's not totally impossible or out of the question, but I think right now the party's going through a lot of infighting. They are not stable enough to win 5%. Now I want to look at Bavaria. Now Bavaria is a state that is somewhat important, but also the elections are kind of irrelevant, and that is because Bavaria has been ruled basically for its entire existence after World War II by one political party, which is the CSU. The CSU is the sister party of the CDU on the federal level. It is a regionalist party, a bit more conservative than the CDU itself, and has this kind of regional identity in Bavaria, and that makes it very strong, that the people in Bavaria consider it to be their own party, and for that reason it has been the largest party in every election since one, only because it was competing with another party similar to it, and the SPD was able to beat them. However, we see here, even if the CSU is losing support or gaining support, they are still clearly ahead by over 20 points, and that result is probably going to not change. Now, what's important for the state is who's going to take second place, who's going to take the opposition leader position, and to be honest, the polls for Bavaria are all over the place. I mean, we've had polls every week, and it's basically a three-way race between the Greens, the AFD, and the Free Voters. And the polling aggregate has them all tied, basically, at 14%. But the polls themselves, as you can see, are very different. You have here the AFD only at 12, and the others at 16. But then you have here the AFD at 17, and the others at 12. You basically have a poll coming out every few days that puts one of these three ahead of the other in multiple different variations. So it's very hard to predict who is going to be the second largest party. I think the CSU is going to win. That's certain. And I think that if the CSU does hold on, unless there's a huge drop in support for the CSU and the Free Voters, which is the current government, that is probably what will be reelected. Makazoda from the CSU will be reelected governor with support of the Free Voters. If the Free Voters fall through, there could be alliance between maybe the SPD and the Free Voters, or the CSU could even go with the Greens. That's unlikely, but they have options. So the chances of the CDU not coming to power is impossible, because it would require pretty much all parties are working together, and the Greens and SPD are not going to work with the AFD. No one is going to work with the AFD, quite frankly, because they've all ruled that out. So there's really no other constellation possible, unless if the Free Voters, the Greens, and the SPD were all to work together. But that is unlikely and almost impossible, because the Free Voters are closer to the CSU on many levels. So not really much happening here. I mean, the AFD is gaining support. The Greens are losing a bit of support from what they had in the last election, but there's nothing too big right here to see. I mean, this, of course, is not the best state to use as a bellwether, because one, Bavaria is a very special state. It's very different than the rest of Germany, and two, this is a state election, and people do vote on the state level differently than they do in that state for the federal level. So lastly, I want to take a look at the results that happened in 2018 for these states, and I want to talk about how important they were. Now, in 2018, this was the kind of beginning of the end of the Angela Merkel era. This was after the 2017 election, and basically the SPD had said they were not going to form another coalition government with the CDU, another grand coalition. And there were coalition talks between the CDU, the Greens, and the FDP to form a Jamaica coalition, because the three colors of those parties make up the Jamaican flag. That was the name given to it. However, those coalition talks failed because the talks between the FDP and the Greens broke down over certain political topics that they could not work through. And so what happened was the CDU and the SPD basically formed another grand coalition, which was extremely unpopular. And it showed that the two major parties, the CDU and SPD, were kind of out of touch. They were holding themselves together. It seemed to be falling apart, and there were a lot of calls to bring this government down. Neither side really wanted to work with another, but there was really no option, because they didn't want to hold another election only a year after the 2017 one. And as we see, in 2018 in Hessen, we saw a 20-point drop in support from the major parties. 10 points each for the CDU and the SPD. The SPD itself dropped to third place for the first time in this state. And for a West German state, this was big. I mean, it happened to them in Baden-Württemberg in 2011, but of course this trend was repeated, and we see even if they were able to tie themselves with the Greens, a 10-point loss, losing a third of their votes was a big deal. We see the AfD also gaining 9 percentage points, going up to 13%, which was beating their 2017 national record of 12.6. One of the best results, the second best result they've gotten in a West German state so far. The FDP and the Left Party gained, and as you can see, what's important to note is that the CDU and SPD lost a lot, and every other party gained support. So it was kind of a shift in the political dynamics in Germany away from the traditional parties to all of the new ones. And in Bavaria, something somewhat similar happened. The CSU lost a lot of support, but was still able to maintain their position at first place. The SPD also suffered a horrendous result, losing over half their votes, falling from the second largest party to the fifth largest party in Bavaria, basically becoming irrelevant. Because not only they're not the opposition party, they're not even the biggest left-wing party in the state. And if you look at the polls, they aren't recovering their position. In fact, they've even fallen, to 8.5, which for a party that used to be one of the top two is not a great result. Now, the Greens were able to rise in this election as well as they did in Hessen and become the second largest party here as well. And this was a great result for them because the party had never been able to break through that kind of 10% gap, 12, 15% in a lot of states other than Baden-Württemberg, which they did in 2011. And so this was kind of the Greens' time to become a mainstream party, and this is when they were really competing with the SPD as the dominant left-wing party. We saw the Free Voters gain some support, and the AfD entered the state for the first time, as well as with Hessen with over 10% of the vote. So these elections were definitely a bellwether, definitely showing that the national parties, the national major parties, were losing a lot of support, and it was a test for them, a test that was kind of an embarrassment for them and led to a lot of changes within the SPD and the CDU. Now, the results of these next elections aren't going to be as drastic because we've already suffered the severe losses. It's not going to happen. It's not going to be a 20-point swing again. Nonetheless, it is an important electoral test. I don't think anything too shocking could happen in either states. The AfD could win big. Theoretically, they could win second place in Hessen. That would be a pretty big shock to the political establishment. The SPD could kind of get a victory if they and the Greens win enough support. And in Bavaria, one of the three parties will take opposition leader. One of the three parties will effectively be the second largest, which will give them some power and influence in the state. But overall, it's more about the numbers and how they affect the federal level. It is also a test for the FDP and Die Linke. Now, in Bavaria, it looks like they're going to both fall through. In Hessen, however, it will be a test. Now, if the FDP loses in both Bavaria and Hessen, loses the representation, that could be a signal to them that they might need to leave the federal government, which could cause new federal elections. But I think it's too early to tell. And like I said, this video is just going to be a brief overview of these two states, and I will do some more videos as the election gets closer. It's on October the 8th, I believe. And as some more polls come out and we get a more defined picture of what's going on, I'll do some more videos on that. But I wanted to give you guys just a brief update of these two states, and that is going to be it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed, and if you do, please like, share, and subscribe. And thank you for watching.